Welcome to Functional Philosophy. I'm Charles Tew. That's T as in tango, E as in echo, and W as in whiskey. This is episode number 16, and its title is Ben Shapiro and the Secular Case for Human Rights.
Lots of people believe in secular human rights. There is no basis for secular human rights. Okay, it's based on your own logic.
That was Ben Shapiro. Now, unlike when I used a clip of Joe Rogan to open this podcast, I am not going to insult Ben Shapiro. Joe Rogan is a moron and deserves to be insulted, but I like Ben Shapiro. What's interesting about him is he is unlike most other conservatives. With most conservatives, you have a breakdown between those who don't take religion seriously versus those who do, and those who do let it influence their politics, obviously, like Santorum, Huckabee, etc. Ben Shapiro is one of those rare conservatives who conscientiously separates his politics from his religion, as much as he can. It's ultimately impossible, but he does it as well as a serious religious person could be expected to. So, I like Ben Shapiro. He's my favorite conservative. I listen to him a lot, but he is disastrously wrong about human rights. In fact, his position is the position of the Enlightenment thinkers. John Locke, for instance. And it is why we have ended up where we are, with human rights being destroyed. The Enlightenment thinkers could not ultimately escape mysticism and supernaturalism. Natural rights theory is a lot like the social contract theory, or existentialism. Insofar as these names are taken as just what the words mean, I can endorse them. They have come to be proper names for specific theories. I am not an existentialist, despite the fact that I believe in existence as primary. I am not a social contract theorist, despite the fact that I believe in the delegation of powers to the government. And I am not a natural rights theorist, despite the fact that I believe rights come from our nature. Now, people like John Locke attempted to ground rights in nature, but they couldn't do it completely, consistently. Instead, they ultimately had simply to point to God and say, well, we come from God, God dictates. God is responsible for our nature, so our rights come from nature through God. It's a kind of uneasy, dual origin kind of idea, but with God being the ultimate foundation. Now the problem is, whenever you justify anything on a foundation of God, you make that idea vulnerable to criticisms of God. Now, as humanity has progressed, as science has progressed, God has become a less and less defensible idea. He has become more and more obviously discredited. Now, the problem is, everything that was argued for on the basis of God is also becoming discredited. And that is exactly what has happened with rights. Because they were defended on a mystical foundation, now that mysticism is being rejected, ostensibly being rejected, rights are being rejected. They're looked at as artificial, conventional. There's no reason for them. In fact, this is what Ben Shapiro just said. You have to have faith in them, that God commanded them. So, as far as human rights go, we have put our eggs in a dangerously frayed basket. And we all worry about the disappearance of human rights. Now, the answer to the increasing violation of human rights is not to start being more religious and thereby prop up rights. The answer is to get a proper, natural, truly and completely natural foundation for human rights. Now, fortunately, we have a complete case for and proof of natural rights with Ayn Rand, who revolutionized every field of philosophy, including this one. So, what is the case for human rights? Natural human rights. Secular, natural human rights. Well, first, what are rights? What are we even talking about? Well, in Ayn Rand's terms, rights are moral principles sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social sphere. A right says, you ought to be allowed to take this range of actions. So, for instance, you have a right to go about your day without being murdered. Being murdered is a violation of your rights because it stops you from taking the actions you should be able to take. Now, Ben Shapiro's contention would be, where does this should come from? Why shouldn't you murder somebody? What in nature tells you that you shouldn't murder somebody? That you should respect his sphere of action? The sphere of action you're talking about. Why should that be respected? It should be respected because every human being's survival has certain requirements, and they are all broadly the same. Every human being requires freedom in order to survive. Well, now the question is, why should you care about survival? Well, first, if you don't care about survival, you should just die. So the fact that you're still living implies that you care about survival. But the real reason is because survival is what leads to happiness. Now, you can say, well, why should you care about happiness? Well, there is no why should you care. Or rather, why should you want happiness? Why should I want happiness? There is no why should you. You simply do. Now, there are multiple senses of want. Want in the sense of you have made that a psychological goal. Well, you don't necessarily want to be happy, in the sense that not everybody is forced to make that a goal. Nevertheless, there is nobody who can say, well, I wouldn't be happy if I were happy. Yes, you would be. That's the nature of happiness. You can't get underneath it. It's like asking, why should you avoid pain? Well, because pain hurts. There is nothing to say. It is simply irreducible. Pain is bad. That's what pain is. By the same token, happiness would make you happy. There is no why should you pursue happiness. Because you would be happy if you achieved happiness. Now, achieving life, surviving in the human way, is what leads to happiness. Now, that's a separate case for another episode. But if you grant that premise, that achieving survival is what leads to happiness, okay. Now we have the foundation. What you should do in your life is survive in order to achieve happiness, because happiness is happiness. All right. Now, in order to survive in a social context, you have to be allowed to take those actions that your survival requires. That means what? It means you have rights. That's what rights are. It's the moral principle that you should be allowed to take those actions that your survival requires. This only comes up in a social context, because it means other people should not interfere with your acting on what your survival requires. So, now the question comes, okay, but why? Why not just murder somebody and take his stuff? Okay, I can see that my happiness requires my survival. Okay, even if I grant that. Well, why isn't it every man for himself, and I kill you to get your stuff, because that aids my survival? Well, this is simply a factual question. It does not aid your survival. First of all, if you go around violating the requirements of other people's lives, you are implicitly endorsing their violating the requirements of your life. Now, you don't want to live in a system that puts you in fear of everybody else because everybody is violating everybody else's rights. So simply for the protection of your own rights, you don't violate other people's rights. But further, other people are more of a value to you as successful, surviving creatures. If you could have everyone on Earth as your slave versus as independent, productive, selfish beings, which would you choose? Which would be of more benefit to you? Now, I think it is obvious that they would be of greater benefit to you as individual people who trade with you their products for yours. If you had everyone as your slave, or you robbed everybody, guess what? You're not getting smartphones, you're not getting computers, you're not getting automobiles, because everybody is going to be forced to stagnate. They're going to live short range because their rights aren't protected. They can't use reason, they can't use long-term thinking because they are bound by your whim, not by reality. Leaving people free is to your benefit. The reason people have rights, the reason you ought not to violate other people's rights, to violate the sphere of action that other people must be allowed to have in order to survive, is because you violate your own sphere when you violate somebody else's. And you make yourself worse off by violating their rights. Other people are more valuable to you as free people than as slaves. So you have an obligation, by the standard of your own life and happiness, which is the only consistent rational standard of value, by that standard you have an obligation not to violate other people's rights. So it comes down to this. Your goal, the only legitimate rational goal, the only valid goal, is survival and the concomitant emotion of happiness. And the only way to achieve that is to defend and respect other people's freedom on principle. It's as simple as that. It's not because God owns all of us and commands you not to violate other people's freedom. It's because other people's freedom is a selfish value to you. Because they are human beings and their success benefits you. And it is logically inconsistent to violate their rights and expect yours to be protected. You need your rights protected in order to survive, and so you have to respect other people's rights, or else you're putting yourself into conflict with everybody, which is not to your benefit. And isn't to your benefit anyway, because other people are more valuable to you as traders than as slaves, as independently free, successful people than as people bound to your will. So, life is the self-evident goal of a human being, and happiness is his self-evident purpose. And if you are going to achieve those two things, you have to respect other people's rights. That's a means to those ends in themselves. That is the justification for rights on a totally natural foundation. You need no mystical being to justify the pursuit of happiness. It's self-evidently good. And as long as you understand why respecting other people's rights is required for your achievement of happiness, then there's no mystery as to the source of individual rights. It's human nature. Human nature dictates that we have to take certain actions to survive and achieve happiness. Therefore, if we want to take those actions, we have to have a social system that allows us to. The moral principle, the ought, comes from the fact that there is a legitimate goal, survival and happiness, and that achieving this goal requires not violating a certain sphere of action of other people. That's it. It's not mystical, and it's not subjective or arbitrary. It's not subjective that survival and happiness be your goal. You can't say, well, I don't necessarily want to be happy. Yes, you do. There's nobody who doesn't enjoy happiness. That's what it means to be happy. So this is not subjective. As a human being, you are simply given a starting point. There's not an infinite regress. There's not a, well, why should I do this? Why should I do this? Why should I do this? Eventually you get back to simply self-evident states of being. Why should you want to be happy? Because happiness makes you happy, and you can't get beneath that. And human rights are the things that in a social context enable survival and happiness, and that is why they are justified. And it is not subjective, it is not arbitrary, and it is not dependent on God or any form of mysticism or supernaturalism. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions about today's episode, you can just send me an email at charles.a.2@gmail.com. You can also visit my website at charlestew.com. There you can find information on and links to all my work, including ways to support it. I'd also recommend you check out my YouTube channel if you like this kind of content and want to see more. I put up videos there sometimes, so you can check that out. Thanks for listening. Let's meet again in episode 17.